Hello, everybody. Kirk Spano, stocks of the week and retirement income options. We're going to start with the macro because it's all the rage to talk about bank failures and bank crises and say things that in the moment sound right, but probably will turn out to be wrong. We were talking off air about the UBS and Credit Suisse merger. And I said that I don't believe that merger will go through. And somebody says, really? Yeah. There's a few things that people need to understand about Credit Suisse. First of all, they're built into the DNA of Switzerland and Swiss banking. It's not going to disappear. And they're especially not going to make the name disappear because they love it. They love Credit Suisse in Switzerland as much as Milwaukee loved Pabst Blue Ribbon. And Pabst Blue Ribbon, when it went down and screwed the unions and reshuffled, and came out with a new owner who bought distressed assets. A few years later, was the beer to drink. Where? Is some of the trendiest spots in America. In particular, I found this out in Boston. Went out to Boston maybe a decade ago, 12 years ago, something like that. And it might have even been a little bit longer, it might have been 15 years ago. And went into a bar in a place called Summersville, which at the time people called Slummersville, but it's gentrified since then. And now it's Summersville and it's a place to be. Walked into a bar, and I've told you part of this story before. My friend, Dr. Tom, introduced me to a neurologist whose name was Cyrus, and I'm not going to say his last name, but back at the time, the movie Spider-Man was out, and Dr. Octavius was the villain. Well, Cyrus's last name, same number of syllables, and sounds a lot like Octavius. Throw an R in there, take out an S. In any case, I looked at him. I said, my name's Kirk. He goes, I'm Cyrus. And he said his last name. And I was like, Cyrus, Octavius, what are you, a supervillain? So that's how I met this guy. Well, he was, pretty well off. He bought the first round of drinks, and it was Pabst Blue Ribbon. And I kind of laughed, and I was like, oh, what did this cost you, like $12? He's like, what? They're $9 a can. I was like, PBR Tall Boys, $9 a can. Wow. It's amazing what repackaging can do, because as a kid and as a college guy, I would buy 6-packs of PBR for $5. And they would go for $1 a can, $1 per tall boy at the bars in Milwaukee, because it was, a beloved beer, but, it wasn't a beer that we looked at and said, oh, highest quality out there. We're paying $9 a can. No. So after the company went down and had to go through a bankruptcy, it was bought and became a trendy brand again. I think that's what's going to happen to Credit Suisse. I think there's going to be shuffling of assets. I don't think that the UBS CEO is going to get what he demanded, which was some of the units that operate in Switzerland that are incredibly valuable, but are being held down in value by the rest of the bank. He probably, if they let that deal go through, was going to double his money instantaneously, maybe triple, because those other units of the bank are that valuable. And the parts of the bank that are holding it down are going to get bailed out by their central bank. I think what's going to end up happening is that come September, October, and there's already all sorts of pressure not to do this merger as it's set up, is that they'll rethink the deal. And those Credit Suisse units will peel off, and everything else will be consolidated into UBS with central bank backing and guarantees and money. And you'll have, instead of two giant banks, you'll have one that's kind of mid-size and boutique, Credit Suisse, and UBS will pick up all the asset management and all the other stuff. Everybody wins. But the smaller Credit Suisse will be less regulated in the future. It'll become a trendy bank again, especially for the super wealthy. Because like in the movies, when somebody goes to Switzerland to talk to their banker in secret, it'll become more and more like that. And a lot of things are happening because of what I've been talking to you about for over a decade now. Since 2012, when I said that the dollar is going to just keep getting stronger and trade at higher and higher ranges. I've been told all along the way by people like are on this screen right now that I was wrong, that the dollar is going to collapse. I still have people telling me the dollar has collapsed because, oh, look, there's inflation, because they don't understand relativism and the fact that compared to all the other major currencies, with a handful of exceptions, the dollar has appreciated, meaning that your buying power as an American, while you might not feel like it's better than virtually everybody else on the planet. And has gotten better since the financial crisis, which I would argue was allowed to happen. I argued it at the time. even it was instigated by the actions of the Federal Reserve, just like the actions of the Federal Reserve the last few years have tended to instigate what is happening right now with the banking system. And it all comes back to the dollar. How do I follow that? How do I come to that conclusion? How was I able to forecast years in advance that you should get out of banking stocks? Remember when I said never own a banking stock, own Microsoft and Apple instead? Doesn't sound like horrible advice now, does it? Because over all those years when I was saying that, which really goes back 11 years, how have the bank stocks done versus Microsoft and Apple? Pretty easy to figure that out. Not even close. And if you really wanted income, all you had to do is sell some covered calls or trim a share of Apple or Microsoft here and there. Not a hard game to play. You always just want to be in the better assets. Then you make the moves that you have to make. And if you're married to the idea of set it and forget it, then don't fucking ever complain to me about you didn't make enough or you lost money. Just set it and forget it. As I've told you over and over again, never works. There's always maintenance to a portfolio. There are always good times to sell options. There's always good times to trim a share or two. Doesn't mean every day, but it means when things get overbought or oversold, you should be doing something. In the middle of the market, where all the narrative happy traders operate, I argue, like Paul Tudor Jones, that you can do nothing. You can just wait for oversold and overbought, and then you do your thing. Paul Tudor Jones said, people say I've missed the meat in the middle. But my experience has been that I make most of my money at the pivots. And even if you're a buy and hold investor, which is okay to be, if you are making some minor trims or additions to your portfolio at the overbought and oversold conditions, selling some puts or calls, depending on which end of the market you're on, you can add a ton of income. Last year, I know that tons of you generated a double-digit return just on the income from selling puts and calls. I know I did. Now, a lot of share prices have fallen for me. That income is still in the account and allowed me to buy more shares. So when these shares rise, rather than owning 100 shares, maybe I'll own 150 because the income from the option selling allowed me to buy more. It turns out to be pretty easy math. So I'm going to show you something from Forest from the Trees by Luke Grumman. There is a thread here right at the top, and they talk about how the Fed program that they just introduced is going to help foreign banks. And it's specifically going to help them with dollar funding. Now, remember when I told you, a year and a half ago, that there was a $1 trillion slush fund for the repo market? That is the first thing that she talks about. She's one of the breathy narrative makers. So is this guy. Cash. They talk about all the collateral that's eligible. Domestic branches of foreign banks can take part in this program. So the money's not going to be sent directly overseas. Big banks with branches in America, say Santander. There's all kinds of banks out there that are from overseas, but they have branches in America's big cities, New York, Chicago, Dallas, San Francisco, things like that. And they need dollars to fund their operation. So the way that this program is designed is that it funds dollars for all of these banks. Basically enables these banks to turn their collateral, which mark to market might be at a 20 or 30% discount right now, at par. The Federal Reserve is taking the risk that the U.S. Treasury and the mortgage-backed securities won't default. Or if they default, they'll be very small. And the interest that they're charging these banks will overcome that. I will remind you that in the last two bailouts that the government did, during the financial crisis and then the repo market in 2019, Federal Reserve and the Treasury came out profitable. Why? Pretty simple answer. Government and the central bank are forever. They don't have 1 year windows. They don't have quarter over quarter obligations that they have to show to shareholders and say, oh, look, we made a profit that quarter. They can say, no, we're perpetual. We're permanent. We don't die. So we can take the duration risk that you can't. We'll fill that 20 to 30% gap until time allows a lot of these securities to come to maturity, which for a lot of them is in that 5 to 10 year window. We've been talking about that since 2020. So why is the Federal Reserve including these foreign banks? Why would the Federal Reserve want to pump dollars into the global economy? It is a pretty simple answer. The more dollars in the world and the more dollar-denominated debt in the world, the more tied to the dollar everybody is. So the Federal Reserve and the Treasury are essentially predators whose real job, as I've told you over and over and over again, is to do what? It's a real question. Protect the dollar. Come on, folks. Teresa, you're not allowed to answer any more questions. You've answered too many. Everybody else, I've talked about this over and over and over again. This has to be understood, and you need to suspend your disbelief that the Federal Reserve doesn't know what they're doing, that the Treasury doesn't know what they're doing. They know what they're doing They're just not telling you what they're doing. They color it in inflation and everything else the economic theories tell you to color it in. The Milton Friedman side, John Maynard Keynes side, the Austrian side, pick an economist, pick an economic school, Chicago school, whatever. It's all theory. Every empire in the world survives because their currency gets used. What happened to the Roman Empire when they started devaluing their currency, right? They went from gold to gold-plated currency. They collapsed. It didn't help that all the politicians were hanging out in orgies, right? They got busy. When they went and stabbed people in the back. Ides of March was just a couple days ago. Et tu, Brutus. The Federal Reserve, the Treasury are protecting the dollar. It's a long-term game. It is the long game defined, really. That reminds me of a story that I've told some of you before. I know it's been on this show before. I was sitting in a bar at a hotel the day before the annual meeting for Exact Sciences. That was the company that I made a ton of money in. Bought it at $1.65. It's been over 100. Guy sits down next to me. He orders a whiskey rye old fashioned. I turn my stool a little bit. I like, you're not from around here, are you? He looks at me. How do you know that? I haven't even said anything. Well, I said, you ordered a whiskey rye old fashioned. If you were from Wisconsin, it would have been a brandy old fashioned. And he laughed and we talked. And at one point in the conversation, went through who he is, who I am. I said to him in response to a question, he asked me if I could write anything, what would I write? I said, I would like to write the real biography of Dick Cheney as a fly in the wall in every room he's ever been in, which at the time, I didn't know it, was kind of like what they talk about in Hamilton, being in the room where it happened. And if I have always suspected that if I had that information, it'd be real easy to make investments. Insider information works. That's why it's illegal, theoretically, except for the people in that room who somehow get a pass. He said, why? Why do you want to write a biography about Dick Cheney? I said, because it is the long game in America. He has been involved for 50 years, him and Kissinger. They know what's going on. They know what the real goals are. They've been very good at keeping their lips tight. I'm sure Liz Cheney knows what's going on. I'd love to see her become a Democrat. Blue dog. It has always been about protecting the dollar. The oil deal with Saudi Arabia was about that. And what's going on now, as the oil age ends, the United States is getting to a point where, we ran deficits to keep the value of the dollar down for decades. And now we're getting to a point where we're going to need a little money for the baby boomer crisis. But realistically, whenever those 2 or 3 years happen and we have to get through that, which I think is, towards 2030, how can we have offsets that minimize the pain? Cheap energy would certainly be one of those things. How do you get cheap energy? You have a firm currency. How do you get a firm currency? You tie everybody to it. That's the long game. It's important that you understand that what's in here, which is super expensive, so I have it. I share it with you once in a while, or at least the key points. But you need to understand that there's a lot of people with a lot of narratives about a collapsing dollar, and they've been wrong forever, about how the Fed doesn't know what they're doing. That's just, for most people, it's naive. But for these people, it's just stupid and dishonest. They know better. And if they don't know better, they should be laughed at. Really laughed at. And they should be called stupid because they're wrong. Nouriel Roubini has made a couple of good trades in his career, and he understands certain things. But what he doesn't understand, and he doesn't even acknowledge, and I've heard him poo-poo it, is that the Federal Reserve has a goal. It's not tied to the economic theories. It's tied to the stability of the United States and geopolitical power. I'll put this up on the chat room. If you read this and you don't come away with it at the second level, read it at the second level. Read it at the level of, why is the Fed doing what they're doing? Give them some credit. Played 2 poker tournaments simultaneously last night and cashed both of them. It's very hard to do. But I always anticipate the mistakes that the other players are going to make. And I bet based on what I want them to do. Now, what they did, I structure my bets in a way that gets them to do something I want them to do. And 80 or 90% of the time, they do what I want them to do. That's what the Fed is doing with the rest of the world and with the markets. They structure what they're doing because they know what's going to come next. If we do this, they'll do that. Now, all of a sudden, after bailing out the world from COVID, and I asked at the time why they were doing so much of it, because they not only filled the hole, they built a mound. And now suddenly they're wiping away that mound to smooth off the ground. What you're finding is that a lot of the banks, some of the companies, took that cheap money, did irresponsible things. Irresponsible things have unintended consequences, and actually consequences that are fairly well known. Buffett warns about stuff years ahead of time all the time. So when I started warning about what's going on now in 2021, I got called a perma bear by people who just have no idea what's going on. some of whom brag about not studying fundamentals or macroeconomics. I just have my magical charts. I laugh. And you're going to see an article out of me, I think, in the next week or two with a title that should crack you up. And it's going to piss somebody else off. When you read this piece here, if you don't come away with one idea, then you need to reread it and think about what I've been telling you for years. How can I be telling you this for years and it keeps coming true? If it's not true, the Fed is manipulating the dollar for the long term, and everything else, if you look at it through that prism, makes a lot more sense. The dollar is a geopolitical tool, and in the future, I'm telling you this in 2023, I started telling you last year, in the future, in the 2030s sometime, the United States is going to have a balanced budget. Yeah, we might run 1 or 2% deficits. We might run 1 or 2% deficits. Now, what happens to the dollar then? Then it gets even stronger. Between now and then, the dollar will be range bound. It's probably going to drift down in the next year or two, because that would be great for the U.S. stock market and for emerging markets. And if it's good for emerging markets, that's good for the dollar. Why? Because then they adopt Bitcoin at a slower pace, or at least a smaller amount of it. Well, then the next time the dollar goes up, say 3, 4, 5 years from now, before it crashes again, which is not really even a crash, it's just a drift down to the bottom of the range, right? Think about what Bitcoin will become worth in the 2030s. And I bring that up because Bitcoin was probably created by us, probably planted in Southeast Asia, and now we dominate it with the help of the emerging markets, the two growth engines on the planet. Think about that. Laundered billions of dollars out of China. Who's that good for? Is that good for China or America? Now the emerging markets are adopting it so they can continue to grow without these blowups when the dollar gets strong. See, the emerging markets aren't anticipating a dollar collapse. They're anticipating a stronger dollar in the future. You think they love it when China comes there and tries to put a thumb on them? Think about all the places in the world that would be better off with a greater level of freedom, more economic ties to the non-authoritarian governments, infrastructure, food, all these things that were in the book Confessions of an Economic Hitman by John Perkins, but without the strings attached. Now all of a sudden, Cuba, Venezuela, and other countries that flirt with Russia and China suddenly say, Uncle Sam's taking care of us. Let's just do our own thing, helps us out when we need it, and we're generating wealth by trading with them. I'm telling you over and over again, the same thing that Warren Buffett's been saying for 50, 60 years. The United States is in the catbird seat. Will be for the rest of your life. Things are just going to keep getting better. Heck, if you had everything in the 1950s plus an iPhone, right? If your entire life was 1950s style, but you had an iPhone, how much better would your life be? Now imagine all the other stuff you got. As George Carlin said, we're all going to need bigger houses because we got too much stuff. Why do you buy a bigger house? Because I had a lot of stuff. Then you fill that house with more stuff, and then you got to buy another bigger house. So I'm kind of a minimalist on stuff. I bought into the whole rental economy way before anybody else. Hey, Kirk, why don't you buy a jet ski? Don't need it. I use it 12 times a year. I'll rent it that day. I don't have to take care of it. I don't have to store it, right? I've been doing that since I was in my 20s. Hey, Kirk, why don't you drive a BMW? Because I like my 4Runner that I got used. Hey, Kirk, why don't you spend money on this or spend money on that or have this thing or that thing? Why don't you have a 3,500 square foot house? I will say, I do want a bigger house, mainly to entertain and have the grandkids over. And that's coming. I've been waiting for this real estate correction that we've talked about for years now, 3 years now. I screwed up not buying something during COVID. Should have at the first month when everything crashed, I should have bought. But even I froze like a deer in the headlights for that. People who moved probably made good moves. But as Rubini points out, and he gets this one right, they were dumb to buy in places that are going to be too hot or flooded. Buy in the Midwest. Buy where there's water and at least enough winter to kill the giant bugs. All right. Tom Lee talked about a lot of this too. Oh, here it is. U.S. dollar swap lines provide dollar funding, at least daily. They might be doing it every couple minutes. So this is not made up stuff. Lots of things going on. So I will write a couple of articles on the banking system, the dollar, an article that's kind of nifty 4-word title. The words in there are liquidity and sentiment. Think about what I'm going to say there. All right. So when you can see the future, you make good investments. Didn't really talk about this much last month when it happened, but I'd point out the way back in 2019 and in 2020, unfortunately leading into COVID, so a lot of us didn't get to ride this all the way up. I talked about a company called Travel Centers of America, 200 some odd truck stops around the country. Company was worth about $150 million at the time. And it switched from being a partnership to being a C Corp. And what did I say? Teresa, what did I say? Why did they turn to a C Corp? I said that they turned into a C Corp because it was foreshadowing either accessing the capital markets or a buyout. And it turned out to be both. The stock, when we first bought it, was $8 or $9 a share. Travel Centers of America, 4 years later, not even 4 years later, 3.5, buys it for $86 a share. Why? Why did BP buy this? Right? They have gas stations all over the country. Why did they buy this? Truck stops along the highway on pretty big pieces of land. Have something to do with the $1 billion they're going to spend on electric vehicle charge points across the United States, putting solar on the rooftops of all those travel centers, giving you a place to eat, maybe clean up, hang out, whatever, for a half an hour to an hour while your car charges. And if you've never been to one of these, they have those great big repair centers for the trucks. Diesel ain't going away anytime soon, but it is going to fall off in the 2030s. Tesla has the semi trucks that'll be good for regional deliveries for sure. But the more you think about it, if they can shrink the batteries more and keep the hauling capacity about the same, which they're not close to yet. They have 20%. They have to shrink those batteries 20% yet, which should happen in the next decade. These trucks, even if they still need a driver, and they will, because level 5 autonomous driving just ain't going to happen anytime soon. These trucks can go cross country at that point. They stop at the travel center. They recharge for an hour, maybe even for 4 hours, and the driver sleeps because they're not really supposed to drive without brakes. They do, they're not supposed to. And this will be a way for regulation to basically be checkpoint to checkpoint using a computer system. Hey, this truck with this driver just pulled into the Travel Center of America on Highway 90 to recharge its battery. So that means that the driver was taking the required time off. I already do it with emissions now, right? Remember when you had used to drive to a place to get your emissions done? And now when you get your oil change, they just do it for you. Oh yeah, we'll do your emissions and we'll send it into the state computer. At least that's how it is in Wisconsin. Why was I super interested in this company? It's because I knew the future. I knew roughly how it was going to go, that this was a valuable asset, and them changing from a limited partnership to a C Corp signaled something. And I had been looking for I've been looking for a truck stop just to buy. So when you think of these things like businesses and you put it into the future of America and you say, okay, what's the general direction of America? You go, so I only knew about this because I had already been looking that direction because I knew the general way that things were going to go and I connected the dots. Unfortunately, I only doubled my money on this. I didn't hold it for the 10 bagger, but it was a 10 bagger. Took under 4 years. A lot of the stocks that we own right now are going to do the same thing. So as we get through this volatility this year, and you're tempted to shake out and say, let's just take the tax loss, write it off. You could have done that with these too. Could have done that with Travel Center America too. And then you would have missed a 10 bagger. So do you want a fraction of a fraction back on your taxes? Or do you want 2 or 3 or 4 of these small cap stocks we're in to go 10, 20, 30 times supernova? So when we screen things, we want to take a look at both overbought and oversold. There are companies in this group that are going to do really well. Get rid of them. Probably get rid of a lot of these. You take a look at these oversold companies with the low RSI. You start to say, okay, which one of these oversold companies have become a value stock? Take a look at. I like how TradingView is calling it supercharts now. Suddenly Pfizer's down at the top of our buy zone. The question to ask is, does it have another leg down? It might. It might, pussycat. But as we get to the 30s, selling a cash secured put becomes a pretty nifty idea. And there's other companies on the ETF side, same thing. The cannabis stocks, if you're able to invest, the halal investors won't do this. But if you're okay with cannabis, it's probably plumbing its bottom. It has been for a while, right? Chopped along the top of the buy zone. That's pretty good, right? Now it's down here at the bottom of the buy zone. I think the same thing's going to happen for Pfizer. Then back up. So this is what I'm looking for. I'm looking for these setups where the damage has been mostly done or done. You get these stable pricing periods, get that little drift down, and then bam, to the moon. I know people get tired of this one. I'm going to do it anyway. This one, under pressure from the shorts, gets that one last drift down. And then you remember, man, there's some pretty big outfits investing in this company. I wonder why they're doing that. Retail float is pushing it down, but the institutional guys are buyers. Maybe the little guys are right this time. They're usually right. The little guys, they're usually right. Oh, wait. Isn't it the other way around? Yeah. So I'm going to put out some ideas for you this week. I'm going to include some of Shooter's wave setups because it starts to show you just how close we are on some of these. Selling those puts on Ford is probably a fantastic idea right now because you want to own it. BlackRock Science and Technology Trust, right? It needs to get into the 20s, a little bit more. It's almost there. I usually aim a little higher than the primary wave setup because a lot of times it inflects, hits it and bounces off. Freeport McMoran. crazy chart. I've shown you the longer term chart. If we can get this in the 20s, we need to be all over it. There is no commodity super cycle, and I'm going to say that in an article too. However, there are certain commodities where the demand will exceed the supply for a long time. Copper is one of them. It's not a rare earth metal. It is not something that we're trying to technologically get around. We are okay using it, and we have a million uses for it. So Freeport-McMoRan, which is incredibly correlated to copper, but it also has some gold, some iron. It's the perfect stock for rebuilding the world, which is a phrase I haven't used in a while, but it is what cures everything, rebuilding the world. So I'll include some more of these. I really don't bother with Crown Castle anymore, but I'll go through these and I'll include them where it's appropriate. And we will have some options that we can sell. Oh, there we go. These times that I've told you to sell covered calls, I hope you're doing it. I just had some covered calls on SunPower expire. Didn't want to give up the stock, but I collected whatever it was, $3-4 in premium. I think it was a second batch that expired on Friday. You take a look at these. Obviously, Travel Center of America doesn't count anymore because it's got bought. Take a look at these. Twitter, who cares? Gone. You try to figure out, if I own some of these, should I be selling covered calls or trimming? Not a lot of things overbought at the minute. But if we get a little rally, a lot of these ones in the 60s and 50s will jump up closer to 70. You don't want to get rid of them. Now, this is just my list. If you take a look at the S&P 500, there's more that are overbought and overvalued. So if you have questions, when I put out the next retirement income options article, ask in the comments, hey, I own this. Should I be selling a put or trimming it, or what should I be doing? All right. Okay. Once again, I implore you, avoid the trader narratives, avoid the short-term view, and anybody who's talking about a collapse in the dollar in the United States is just wrong. All right. Have a great day. I have a lot to do, and I will get a lot of stuff out here for you this week because I think that we're getting close. And I would like you to engage on the posts where it's specific to your topic. And I think you should jump into the chat if you want to be a little bit more up to date. During times of volatility, even if you're not regular in the chat rooms, you should be using the chat room a few times a week just to check in. Ask a question if you like. I answer them. And the chat room at Fundamental Trends is under construction again. So we are very close to having 4 different chat rooms in that on that website. So that'll be cool. All right. Have a great day and look for a lot of content. Take care.